And some say that some of those churches even saw the Islamic invaders as liberators in some way. Now, Leo survives the ordeal, and as soon as he is able, he leaves town. He crosses the Alps to find Charlemagne. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you again to another episode of the Uncensored Pilgrims. As always, I'm Marty McLain, along with the irrepressible Paul Price. Paul, what's your name again?
I can't remember. It's too early.
It's early.
Early Sunday morning this time.
Yes, we are doing an early Sunday morning podcast. That's just how it works for us today.
I've already had my coffee more than once, and it's doing something, but I need even more coffee.
All right, we may have to take a pause here. Pause for Paul.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to deal with the 7th and 8th century of church history today. And, you know, Paul, the biggest thing that happened to the church in the 7th century wasn't even Christianity. It was Islam.
I just want to make one comment before you get into it.
Okay.
We need to start off by talking about a haircut, I think. No, I'm just kidding.
No. Not everybody likes our conversation about a haircut. I think that might be somebody who...
We got a nasty comment on YouTube.
I think he's follically impaired.
Probably. He probably got...
He's follically impaired.
Got a little bit self-conscious when we started talking about a haircut.
Because he hadn't had one in years. Okay. Shout out to the listener. Okay, but the biggest event that happened in Christianity in the 7th century was Islam. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Islam. Paul's has a lot of apologetic type information about Islam, but started by Muhammad. He lived from 570 to 532 AD. He was born in Mecca, which is, of course, in present-day Saudi Arabia. He was uneducated, possibly illiterate. Some believe he had epilepsy. Now, early in life, he married a woman who was 15 years older than he was. She was a widow lady. And so he became a trader, and he did a lot of business with some Christians and Jews, and some people think that they were possibly under some Gnostic-type influence. But it all changed in 610 AD. At the age of 40, the angel Gabriel supposedly appeared to him and called him to be a prophet. Now, people really didn't pay attention to him in Mecca, in his hometown. Eventually, they ran him off. And he goes to Medina in 622 AD, where the message finds fertile ground. He preached Islam. Islam itself means submission to the will of Allah. And within 10 years, in 632 AD, he has 50,000 followers, and Jerusalem is conquered. So it starts spreading. Islam would eventually easily conquer northern Africa and go up into Syria. At that time, the Eastern Empire, which was, Constantinople was the capital, they'd been at war for years with the Persian Empire. It was a continuation of the Greco-Persian Wars. And so at this time, they were both weakened because of their long military battles against one another. And they were kind of ripe for, a strong Islam to come in there while they're weakened. And, of course, the Persians were defeated. And a lot of the churches in the area of North Africa and Syria, they had been weakened as far as their alliance to the Eastern Church because of some of the theological controversies of the day. The say it, Paul.
Monophysite?
They were monophysites, and that had kind of broken them away somewhat, their allegiance and all to the Eastern Empire. And some say that some of those churches even saw the Islamic invaders as liberators in some way to help liberate them from the influence.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, and it's too much of a rabbit hole to get down too deeply, but it is worth mentioning that a lot of those, facts that you were listing out there about Muhammad need to be taken with a grain of salt, because they're coming down to us as the quote-unquote standard Islamic narrative, which comes to us through their traditions. But the problem is, unlike the Bible, these traditions that they pass down about Muhammad really can't be traced back even to the same century in which Muhammad lived. So, just take that history about Muhammad with a grain of salt, because there's a lot we really cannot know for sure about who he was and what he really believed and taught. A lot of that stuff has been kind of filtered down through the ages and censored, and books have been burned. Verses have been cherry-picked and things like that. So, a good guy to go to on YouTube for that is Dr. J. Smith. He talks a lot about delving into the history of Islam. Even the city of Mecca is in some ways kind of a made-up history. It's not an ancient city like the Muslims claim that it is.
Okay.
It doesn't date back to the time of Abraham. It's not ancient because there's not even a reliable water source in the city of Mecca. It's a city that they constructed later on and made up a fake history about for their fake religion that they invented.
Okay.
So delve into that on your own time, but it is interesting to learn how much of the Islamic history is just flat out made up.
That's why we call you Paul the Pounder. you just bring it, man. He just brought it. I mean, that just basically ends conversation. But
they're building all the skyscrapers and stuff now in Mecca.
Yeah.
And they're building them right on top of what are allegedly these ancient holy, like the site where Muhammad was born and where he lived and all this. They're covering them in parking lots.
Oh, goodness.
And you wonder now, why would they do that? Why would they want to cover these ancient holy sites in parking lots and skyscrapers?
So would they say they paved paradise and put up a parking lot?
Yeah, something like that. But it's interesting. Normally, great archaeological discoveries happen when you dig.
Yeah, you can't dig past that asphalt.
But the problem is they're digging, and what are they finding? Nothing.
So covered up with
covered up in asphalt. Because there's nothing there. The city was not ancient. It was a made-up history. So that's why they're covering them in
and Paul
skyscrapers
says this
and
with
asphalt.
a big smile on his face. All right. Okay, here's one of the things that Constantinople wanted to do. They wanted to conquer the Eastern Empire. Of course, they also wanted to conquer Rome, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But in 670 AD, the Muslims attacked Constantinople. I mean, you see, to be at the point where they were able to do that in just a few decades after starting, I mean, they came to power and they came at it pretty hard. I mean, it was fast and furious.
Yeah, the history might be made up, but they really were a people and they really did rally around something.
Yeah.
It might have been a heretical sect of Christianity to begin with.
Well, they did it with a vengeance. And they're going to attack Constantinople. Of course, you know what Constantinople looks like there. You know, it's surrounded by water, a little isthmus there. And they launched a sea attack, and the Eastern Empire fortunately had what they would call a secret weapon. It was developed by a Syrian scientist named Klinikos. It was called Greek fire. Now, this was an incendiary liquid. It was made up of an oil-based jelly. It was sprayed under pressure, and some would say it was flamethrower style.
Like napalm, right?
Yes, and they'd have jets that were mounted on the prows of these boats, and they would especially equip for that purpose. And everything that this stuff landed on, it turned into an oily fireball.
Okay.
And what I've read is that the only way you could put it out was to smother it with sand or to dilute it with vinegar. And, you know, sailors don't have a bunch of vinegar.
You don't normally carry that in your rations as a sailor.
I don't think
a big pouch of vinegar.
And you probably didn't have a lot of sand on that boat. So basically, when the Muslims tried to take Constantinople by sea and the Greek Navy shows up, they set all the Islamic ships on fire.
Yeah.
And the city is preserved.
Okay.
So you know, Greek fires are very interesting. If you go look up some of the stuff pertaining to it, the formula, it was a closely guarded state secret, they said, for about 500 years, and then somebody forgot how to do it.
Yeah, too closely
and so
guarded,
we really don't know exactly how they did it. They have some ideas about what some of the components of it might have been, but it was lost through time.
It's kind of like when you got something that you really want to keep safe and you put it in a place that even you can't remember.
Nobody would think about including yourself.
Including yourself, yeah.
Yeah, somebody forgot. Now, I don't remember where we put that thing.
Yeah.
Boy, we sure could use it about right now. Okay, but now, interesting to note that the Muslims did provide a certain measure of religious freedom. You could not proselytize if you're not Islamic, but you could exist. You'd have to pay higher taxes, and you'd have to do something that set you apart, like as a Christian. I think I read where someone would have to wear a huge cross. And as I mentioned,
you had to pay an extra tax, right? I think they call it the jizya.
Something, you paid an extra tax, and you wore some type of identification. As mentioned earlier, the churches in Egypt and Syria, the Coptic church in Syria, and the church that they had, the Coptic church, in Egypt, and then the church they had up in Syria, they had been alienated from the Orthodox church because of monophysitism. And
you
so
did that good. That was good.
Thank you. That was easy pickings by the Islamic invaders. And one of the things also about Islamic people is that they allowed no icon or pagan imagery. Also of note, they built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in 688 A.D. And by 711 A.D., they were invading Portugal and Spain.
Okay.
So they got on it pretty quick. Now, Paul, the 5 pillars of Islam, just as we mentioned real quickly, the declaration of faith, praying 5 times each day, facing Mecca.
Facing where?
Mecca.
So the earliest place, there's historical evidence that it didn't originally face Mecca. It actually faced a city called Petra.
Petra.
That's where all the earliest mosques actually faced.
Oh.
And they kind of changed history when a more dominant group wanted to make Mecca become the center. They had to change history.
Wow, as they now say in South Georgia, that's muy interesante.
Muy interesante, yes.
Okay. Also, you had to give money to charity or those in need. There's fasting during the month of Ramadan, and you had to have that pilgrimage to Mecca.
Yeah.
With all the asphalt and the big buildings.
Well, yeah. And, the Dome of the Rock is interesting, too, because it's supposed to be allegedly, historically, according to the Islam narrative, it's where Muhammad ascended into heaven and was caught up to heaven. But if you read the inscriptions in there, it doesn't happen to mention that. That's odd.
You think that would be mentioned.
You would think it would be mentioned, but instead it's a bunch
of... oh, by the way.
Yeah, oh, by the way. But instead it's a bunch of references to Jesus and saying how he's not the Son of God. He's not
they
God.
Do say Jesus is not the Son of God. He didn't die on
and
the
it
cross.
Makes you think maybe that they were originally actually a heretical Christian sect.
Wow.
And that was their original viewpoint, and then with time, for whatever reason, they made further changes and needed to kind of rewrite history, as it were.
Yeah.
So.
Well, they did try to get in all of Europe from Spain, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but Charles the Hammer Martel stopped them at the Battle of Tours.
Okay. So
you had them being stopped over in the east with the Greek fire, and then you had them being stopped over in the west by Charles the Hammer Martel.
Yeah.
And so, but eventually, they conquered about half of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing the amount of territory.
Yeah.
That came under their control. Anything else you'd like to say about Islam?
No, I think there's just a lot of rabbit holes you can fall down into, but it's interesting to look at the history of it and to see how, the name Muhammad is really a title that means beloved one. Mm-hmm. And the earliest people using it, I mean, it's actually a title that goes back thousands of years, even into the BC era,
mm-hmm.
But, the earliest inscriptions that you'll find about it may have actually been references to Jesus.
Okay.
So, and a lot of the Quran itself appears to be plagiarized from early Christian works, heretical Christian works, like Nestorian stuff and things of that nature. So it's a patchwork of various things mashed together, mm-hmm. Changed here and there, much like the way that Joseph Smith did hundreds of years later.
Who also saw an angel.
Who also claimed to see an angel and also claimed to be given a new religion. It's almost like history repeated itself with the Mormon religion, what happened with Islam. So, and both have been very, very damaging things that have happened in history. Both have done a lot of damage to the world. So.
Yes. Now, one of the things you mentioned about Islam is that they do not see a division between the state and Islam. That's why every nation...
Unless you ask Saudi Arabia. Okay. That's a little bit of a different story.
How so?
Well, Saudi Arabia is in the midst of trying to secularize because they want the money. They need the investors. Mm-hmm. They need to revamp their version of Islam, so they're actively trying to revamp their version of Islam to become more Western friendly and more secularized. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But that's what they're trying to.
That sounds like that's going to get some people killed.
I think it probably will. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now moving on from Islam, we're going to pick up Christianity in England in the 7th and 8th century, but we're going to go all the way back to Patrick, who lived between 389 and 461 A.D. Saint Patrick, He grew up in northeast England, was kidnapped at the age of 16 by some Celtic pirates from Ireland, sold into slavery. After 6 years, he eventually was able to get his freedom, had a dream about a ship coming and, said, man, somebody's coming to get me. And look, there it was. And anyway, long story short, eventually he gets his freedom, returns to England eventually. At the age of 38, in response to another dream that he has, he returns to Ireland to minister to his former captors. Before leaving, Patrick is confirmed as a bishop to Ireland, and he returns in 432 AD. He's accompanied by a small entourage of priests and seminarians. Ireland was being evangelized by Patrick and his followers. I mean, they did an incredible job. I mean, these are kind of vicious people, the native people at that time.
Yeah.
They were not like, well, I think Irish have always been known as fighters. They've always been, you get
Did
them.
they ride dragons, though?
I don't know.
Isn't there a movie about that?
Pete's Dragon?
Well,
Was Pete Irish? I just remember Darby O'Gill and the Little People.
You're going back to the 60s now.
Now, let me tell you, the Darby O'Gill and the Little People, worst movie, one of the top 5 worst movies I've ever seen. I, as a boy, walked out of Darby O'Gill and the Little People.
What is that about?
I don't even know I
Leprechauns?
left.
Oh.
I left. It was horrific. It's like
There's a lot of
Disney
bad
movie.
movies to do with leprechauns, like that whole Leprechaun series.
Wasn't
Like,
there one that killed people?
yeah, that's what I'm talking about. The horror
no,
movie.
That didn't happen.
Leprechaun.
No, Darby O'Gill and Little People. It was not a horror movie. It was just
I think Warwick Davis is the leprechaun.
Warwick Davis. Never heard of him. Now, I did see an Irish movie with John Wayne in it. And he was okay, but, it just wasn't the same as when he's, a Western. It just wasn't the same, man. It just was not the same. But anyway, Patrick evangelizes Ireland, and eventually they go over to the north of England, in Scotland and places like that, and they start to work southward. Now, the work continued under men like Columba and Aidan over the decades and into the 7th century. However, simultaneously, remember when Pope Gregory, we saw this last week, he arrives, Pope Gregory becomes Pope, and as a younger person, he had seen some Anglo-Saxon slaves in the slave market and kind of had a heart for them, and then he sends all these monks to England to evangelize. The king of, I think, the king of Kent gets saved, and he sets up his headquarters as the center of Christianity, which is Canterbury, and that's where Christianity becomes centered there in England. So you have the Roman Christians in the south who are spreading the gospel, and they're coming up from the south going to the north, and then you have the Celtic Christians who have now come from the west and from the north, and they're coming down and they meet up together. And a lot of the ones from the south were Saxons.
It's popular today. The story that we're told now in media is that, if you're spreading Christianity to the Celts or to the native people, then you're the bad guy, and you should just let them believe and be the way that they were before, right? But
killing and eating people.
I think if you really look at the history, it's a little different. I think
Yes.
I think if those people who are pushing that narrative were forced to go see what those people were really like, I think they might change their tune.
Yeah, it's like when you read about the history of the Aztecs and the Mayans and Incas. You're like, boy, they liked to cut people's hearts out while they were beaten.
While they were still alive.
And they liked to eat people.
Yeah.
But they didn't eat their own people, they just ate their enemies.
Yeah.
Instead of, there's a big difference between love your enemies and eat your enemies.
Big difference.
I mean, just basically, I want to be in a culture where, love your enemies, not eat your enemies. But anyway, that's there's a continuation of this. So you have the Celts coming down, the Celtic monks coming down from the west and from the north, and you have the monks who were sent from Rome coming up from the south going to the north, and they met up together, and so you had an intermingling of this two different types of branches of Christianity. The Celts did things different than the Roman Church did. They even celebrated Easter on a different date, and that was a big issue because you had the King Oswy, who was the king of Northumbria, and that's where a lot of this clash took place. I think he was with one side, his wife was with another side, and they wouldn't even celebrate Easter on the same date. And so it became such a contentious issue, among other things, like I think even the haircuts that the monks had. that they had to settle it out. We got to decide whether or not we're going to adopt Celtic Christianity or the Christianity coming out from Rome. So King Oswy, he calls a synod at Whitby in 664 A.D. and he is told, he's got to decide whether or not he's going to side with the Celts, and we're going to go with the Celtic date for Easter and the way they do things, or we're going to go with the Roman date for Easter and the way they do things. Well, during the conversation of everything, when they have this synod there at Whitby, he is told that the church at Rome was established by Peter.
Yeah.
And he was also told, Peter holds the keys to the gates of heaven.
Yeah.
And so when he finds that out, here's what he says, quote, "Is that really so? Does Peter guard the gates of heaven? Then I tell you, Peter is guardian of the gates of heaven, and I shall not contradict him. I shall obey his commands in everything to the best of my knowledge and ability. Otherwise, when I come to the gates of heaven, he who holds the keys may not be willing to open them."
Yeah.
So that's all it took. They said, we're started by Peter, and he holds the gates, keys to the gates of heaven. And the king was like, "Oh, what do y'all have to offer? I'm going to go with Peter and the Roman church. We're going to celebrate Easter when they say, and we're going to do things the way the church from Rome's doing it, because Peter holds the keys to the gates of heaven." And that's how England came under Roman Christianity.
Okay, it was a little bit easier back then, huh?
And we know this from Bede the Venerable, not to be confused with Ming the Merciless. He wrote History of the English Church and Its People.
Yeah.
And we learn a lot about he's first to use the phrase.
Now, do you think Peter really is standing at the pearly gates of heaven and holding the keys?
No, but it worked. It worked at that point. It worked for him, okay? Yeah. It worked for him. But Bede the Venerable was the first to use the phrase, the year of our Lord. And this guy was very committed. I mean, I don't even know if he hardly ever left a monastery. But they say on his deathbed, this guy who wrote the History of the English Church, they said that on his deathbed, now imagine you're dying, okay?
Yeah.
You're on your deathbed. He translates the Gospel of John from Latin into English.
He just whips it out.
I mean, I'm dying. Bring me the Latin, and he it's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, what dedication. Anyway, so that's how church kind of got going there in England. We need just a quick reference here. There was the Third Council of Constantinople in 681 A.D. It's the sixth council of the church. They denounced monothelitism and affirmed the Council of Chalcedon. Monothelitism said that Jesus has two natures, but only his divine nature made choices. That the two natures never disagreed. So it's another thing about the two natures just kind of monkeying with it.
Yes.
Instead of saying, okay, he's fully God, fully man, they still just want to kind of...
Yeah.
And so they're saying, no, we got to stick to what's right.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about some of this theology stuff. If it goes off, it's like an angle. If you have like a 3-degree angle, when it first starts out, baseline, top line, you can't see much of a difference. But over time...
But the further out you get,
the bigger
further
the difference.
away it becomes.
So it does make a difference. Over time, there's more stuff and that's why, I appreciate some of these councils. Okay, now let's go back to the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, we dealt with the Frankish kings last week.
Yes.
Clovis. He was the beginning of the Merovingian dynasty. Ruled for approximately 200 years. They were eventually supplanted by the Carolingian dynasty that began with Charles the Hammer Martel. Like I mentioned, he is famous for stopping the Muslims as they were trying to get into France at the Battle of Tours. Charles started out as being a mayor or a prime minister of the palace there for the Merovingians. But the Merovingians, they were very weak. I think I read one place where one of the guys would be carried around in a wheelbarrow. It's just... Were
they inbred or something? Did they have disease? I don't know.
It's just like Lower Carroll County. I mean, it's just move me around in a wheelbarrow.
Well, I ask because some of those dynasties were heavily inbred.
Yes,
like,
there was a lot of inbreeding with some. That's why you had the hemophiliacs and
people
some
didn't
jaw,
realize
the Habsburg jaw or whatever they called it.
Yeah, people didn't realize how bad that was.
It's not good.
It's really unhealthy.
You want a big gene pool. You don't want it to be like a thimble.
Yes.
You know, it's
Yes.
you just want a decent size.
They call it
gene pool.
hybrid vigor.
Hybrid vigor.
That's what they call that.
Okay, I reckon that's putting a little positive.
Yeah. Well, no,
spin to it.
that's the opposite of being inbred.
Oh,
Hybrid vigor is the
I was
opposite.
about to say, because that sounded pretty good.
No,
I was
no,
thinking,
that's what happens when you don't inbreed.
Oh, okay.
You get hybrid vigor.
Hybrid vigor.
Yes.
I like that.
Because you're hybridizing.
So are you hybrid vigor?
Well, I don't know.
You don't know?
I'm English, German. That's about it.
You know,
mostly English.
I remember.
Really.
You know, I'm not
Welsh.
I would not recommend Richard Pryor. He was a comedian, and he was not always the cleanest man.
Yeah.
But I remember, I think they were doing a biopic on him one time.
Yeah.
And I was watching something about him, and he was saying, you know, that he had all kinds of blood in him. I don't remember what all he said. Is you know, all kinds of.
Yes.
You know, so he said it was very hard for me when I was growing up. He said I'd be walking down the street and they'd say, "Get him! He's all of them." So, all right. So anyway, Charles the Hammer. He stops the Islamic incursion into that part of Europe. Of course, they did get into Spain and Portugal for quite a long time.
I wonder what he did that was unique that enabled him to stop the.
He just put the hammer down, man.
Just put the hammer down.
He was Charles the Hammer, man. He just, you know, when it's hammer time.
Yeah.
I mean,
the original MC Hammer.
He was the original Hammer.
Yeah.
Okay. But when he dies in 743 AD, his family fought over his power, his inheritance, and during the meantime, there you still had the Merovingian dynasty, although they had put one of them, like, kind of locked them up. So they were technically kings, but the Charles Martel and his family was kind of acting it out. And so while they're fighting for, you know, who's going to control what with, you know, Charles Martel's legacy, there's another Merovingian put on the throne, but in 751 he's beheaded in order to make way for Pepin the Short, the son of Charles Martel. Now Pepin had come to grips with being a king with no apparent divine sanction. So now when the last of the Merovingian dies and the Carolingians, starting out with Clovis, when he becomes king, Pepin is king, wants to be king, but he doesn't have divine sanction. And so he has a correspondence with Pope Zachary. And this is actually prior to him deposing of the last of the Merovingians, the Childeric III. And he wrote whether or not it was, quote, good that at that time there were kings in France who had no royal power, unquote. So at the time, the Pope was looking for a way himself to rid himself of the power and possessions of the Eastern Emperor. You had the Lombards, who had territory to the north of Rome. They had their allegiance to the Eastern Empire. And currently, there had been a lot of east-west tension over the icon controversy that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The Pope needed some backing for assurance, so he wrote back and he said, quote, by means of his apostolic authority, so that order might not be cast into confusion, he decreed that Pippin should be made king.
Wow.
So in 751 AD, Pippin is crowned as the new king of the Franks by the Archbishop of Metz, who had served as the Pope's representative. The stage is set for kings to now begin to regard themselves as being in contact with God, and that they're approved and protected by God Almighty, and that they're entitled to think of themselves as deputies on earth. Now that's from a quote from Dan Jones, who writes a really good book on this this period of history. So you've got Pepin says, look, I need divine sanction. Would you be willing to do it? I'll be a strong king. The Pope's like, okay, I need some help with the Eastern Empire.
Yeah.
So there's kind of quid pro quo, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'll give you divine sanction, but you got to help me get rid of these people.
Yeah.
And 3 years later, Pepin would meet a new pope, Pope Stephen II, and they would strengthen their mutual agreement of the Pope, giving legitimacy to the Frankish kings, and the Frankish kings serving as the protectorate of the papacy. Pepin would dispossess the Lombards of their land in northern Italy. He would give it to the Pope, and it would be under the control of the papacy until 1870. It would be called the Papal States. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Frankish kings, because remember, Rome really doesn't have, there's no really emperor over there now.
Yeah.
And so they need a protectorate, and the Eastern's not really looking out for them.
Yeah.
And so he's now got the Frankish kings to the west saying, I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. Give me the divine sanction, and we'll start taking care of you.
Yeah.
And
it's
so
amazing how far Rome fell, huh?
From
where it once was.
Yes, you see how the play between religion and state and religion right now. So Pepin dies in 768, and his son Charles becomes king. Now Charles is a big man, he's over 6'3" tall, which is really big back then. It's kind of a decently tall guy now. He was a military genius, enjoyed a lot of success. Every people group that he would conquer, he'd make them become Christians, or they would die. I think I read somewhere where maybe he chopped off about 3,500 heads one time.
Wow.
Because they wouldn't convert. He believed that the church and state should work together for the benefit of society. He had a lot of reforms that he engaged in, from political, cultural, and religious. And the types of reforms that he engaged in, they were eventually became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. So it's a big deal. I mean, he did a lot of good things. But, you would probably know Charles as Charlemagne.
Yes.
That's what he became known as. Now, he had an interesting relationship with Pope
Was
Leo.
he German or French?
French.
Okay.
But he had an interesting relationship with Pope Leo III. When he was made Pope, Charlemagne sent a lot of gold and silver, and some of the aristocrats in Rome, they didn't like that the Pope was so dependent upon the Frankish kings. Also, I think they kind of wanted some of that loot that the Pope was acquiring, more and more wealth.
Yeah.
So, on April 25th, 799 A.D., Leo III, he's leading a procession through the streets of Rome, and these aristocrats, they had hired a bunch of thugs, and they kidnapped the Pope at a procession now. They cut off all his Pope clothes. They tried to gouge his eyes out. They cut his tongue out. They torment him for over 24 hours until finally he is rescued by some Frankish ambassadors who just so happen to be in Rome. Now, Leo survives the ordeal, and as soon as he is able, he leaves town. He crosses the Alps to find Charlemagne. And when he finds Charlemagne, they work out a deal together. Once again, the Frankish kingdom would become the defender of the Pope, and in return, Leo would give Charlemagne the coronation of, quote, Emperor and Augustus. So Charlemagne sends Leo back with the support of Frankish troops. They come and they take care of his enemies, and then Charlemagne himself shows up in November of 800 A.D. with a lot of ceremonial, pomp, circumstance, all that kind of stuff is a big deal. Then on Christmas Day, 800 A.D., at St. Peter's in Rome, Charlemagne is coronated and given that title, Emperor and Augustus. Now, supposedly, Charlemagne did not know it was going to happen. That's what they want. Oh, you won't. But he shows up. I think he shows up in a toga.
Wow. So it's
what
a coincidence.
Oh, whoa, what are you doing, Pope? Oh, no. But anyway, it happens. He is crowned Emperor and Augustus. And Charlemagne kind of got a little bit carried away with it in some ways. And he himself eventually started appointing bishops and basically dictating policy to the
As
Pope.
I understand it, Charlemagne and that whole Holy Roman Empire, wasn't that really more than just what we think of today as France?
Well, eventually he takes France and Germany.
Yeah.
And what happens is he defeats more and more undefeatable people, so to speak, and, quote, converts them to Christianity.
Yeah.
He becomes a bigger and bigger deal.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he becomes such a big deal that in the East, there's this empress. Her name was Irene.
Yeah.
And she was a bad woman. I mean, she's a bad lady. Her husband had died. She had a son. And she really didn't want her son to become emperor. They kind of had some disagreement on some stuff. So she wanted to keep power because he was young.
Where was this? Was this in Constantinople?
Yeah, in Constantinople.
Okay.
And so she was the empress. And she wanted to be called empress. And
Yeah.
some people said sometimes she even wanted to be called the emperor. That's kind of weird.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, Irene had some issues.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way. Eventually, she had her own son's eyes gouged out
Wow.
so that he wouldn't be, worthy of being an emperor,
Yeah.
so that she could keep power. And word on the street is that Charlemagne proposed to her.
Huh.
So if Charlemagne had all this territory in the west, and then if he married the emperor in the east, you could unite once again.
Yeah, but it sounds like a woman like that might not want to be under Charlemagne.
Well, I think she would have been open to the idea. Now, here's the deal, though. Leo almost had his eyes gouged out.
Yeah.
And if Charlemagne's saying, Leo, I know she has this thing for eyes, but Leo's probably like, no,
Yeah.
I don't even know if he could talk if he has his tongue cut out. I mean, he might have written on a piece of paper,
Yeah.
do not do this,
Yeah.
But anyway, Irene, interesting that, now, you could probably debate whether or not he actually proposed to her.
Yeah.
But some say that there was some type of a proposed alliance
Yeah.
between the two. And you could understand you have these Frankish kings that are very powerful in the West now. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And Constantinople, they've lost a lot of their territory from Islam. I mean, they lost North Africa, they've lost Syria and all that area. I mean, they've lost tons of territory. They're growing weaker, but now the Frankish kings are ascending. They're growing in power.
So it would be almost like if the United States fell as an empire, and then let's say Mexico started rising in power.
Okay.
But they wanted to style themselves after the United States, and they asked for the blessing of Washington D.C. to give them legitimacy in their new government, something along those lines.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways. When you're up and coming, you want people to acknowledge that you're worthy.
Yeah.
You see some of these British movies, and you have commoners. Or you have a rising middle class. They're merchants, and they make a lot of money.
Yeah.
But they're not lords, they're not barons, they're not in the aristocratic class. But yet some of them have more money than the aristocrats.
Yeah.
Then that's kind of you don't have the title.
It creates tension.
Yeah, it creates tension. So, and they had to work hard to get the Pope's approval, divine sanction to start out with, and they got it, and now they thought, hey, I hear that lady over there in the Eastern Empire, she ain't got her husband, her husband's dead, her boy ain't got no eyes, and she may be available. And so there was some say he proposed. But anyway, here's another little interesting tidbit that goes along during this time. It's called the Donation of Constantine.
Okay.
It was a forgery. It was a medieval forgery that supposedly came from Emperor Constantine, in which he basically bequeathed his land and authority to the Church in Rome. Quote, in other words, this document not only reiterated the traditional papal belief that the authority of the priest is superior to that of secular rulers, but it also dealt with the particular and current question of the right of the popes to govern and dispose of Rome and other Byzantine territories in Italy, unquote. That's a quote by Walker's History of the Christian Church, a very good book. So the Pope supposedly had this letter that says, Constantine gave it to me.
Yeah.
It was a forgery. And people believed it for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And then eventually people realized that was a forgery. But after they, everybody acknowledged that's a forgery, it had already accomplished the purpose for which it was intended. The Pope got what he wanted.
Yeah, exactly. And so in those days, see, the government always needs to... The government always needs some sort of legitimacy. It needs to draw its legitimacy from somewhere.
Okay.
So in those times, the legitimacy of the government was derived from the church.
Yeah.
At this point, they needed the Pope to say, God is giving you legitimacy.
I'm the ruler. The Pope said so.
But now in our day, the culture has rejected God. Mm-hmm. So we get our legitimacy from this appeal to quote-unquote democracy, right?
Yes.
And so now even somewhere like North Korea, you know what they're called? The Democratic People's Republic.
You mean Kim Jong-un
DPRK.
was not
Democratic
elected?
Yeah, well, everybody claims to be democratically elected. So today, in our day, using the word democracy is like it used to be using the word, divinely instituted.
Yeah.
Now we say it's democratically elected. Yeah. But
it is funny how a lot of those countries have Democrat in their name, and they're
But I wonder if democracy in America is any more real than Peter holding the keys of heaven at the pearly gates. Yeah. I wonder.
It's interesting. You're getting to conspiracies. Watch it, Paul. You're swerving. Okay, let's talk about the iconoclast controversy. We're going to go back to 726 A.D. Emperor Leo. This is not the Pope. A lot of people are named Leos, like Bob or Marty, Paul. Anyway, Leo, Emperor Leo.
Do you have a favorite Leo? Mine is probably the Ninja Turtle.
Leonardo. I never watched Ninja Turtles, man.
That's
just didn't.
Well,
didn't have time. Didn't have desire. Didn't have motivation.
It's a generational thing.
It probably is. I don't know if anybody named Leo. I had a neighbor one time named Mr. Leo.
Okay.
He's a good guy. So, Leo's a great name. But this guy, Emperor Leo, he's in 726 A.D. Emperor, he comes out in opposition to icons. He felt like God had been displeased with idolatry associated with the icons. And after the second defense of Constantinople against the Arabs, the Muslims, he took this position. He then had the image of Christ that was above the entrances of the imperial palace in Constantinople. He had it destroyed. So people were actually worshiping some of these paintings, some of these depictions. And it became a big deal. And so he said, you know what? God's not pleased this is happening. That's why we're having this issue with these Islamic invaders. And so I'm going to destroy all these icons. And when he starts to destroying the one that's above the imperial palace, a big picture of Christ, riots ensued. A lot of monks and nuns and a lot of the common people, some of the women came out. I think I've read, they came out with pots and pans.
Yeah.
They're really upset about it. And so these guys are up on these ladders, tearing down this big painting of Christ, this big mural or whatever it was of Christ. And older nun pushed a worker off a ladder.
Wow.
And he died. And her name was Theodosia. She was arrested, and for 7 straight days, from what I read, she was given 100 lashes every day. Then on the 8th day, she was sentenced to die by having a ram's horn driven through her neck. Now,
that's one way to do it, I guess.
Why you would say, it'd be a good thing if we would drive a ram's horn through somebody's neck.
I don't know where they would come up with that.
I don't know, but the thought of that is pretty intense.
Yeah.
It's pretty intense. But, that's what he did. So eventually she was venerated and she became
So did they actually carry out the sentence on her?
Oh, yeah, she died.
Yeah.
And they made a saint out of her, years later. She was, so Theodosia.
The Eastern Church did, obviously.
Yes.
The Orthodox Church.
Yes. So the Patriarch of Constantinople, he's the equivalent to the Pope in the West, he was against Leo's move, so Leo removed him. The controversy has been labeled the iconoclastic controversy. Those who wanted to smash the icons were called iconoclast, icon smashers, and those who wanted to keep them were called iconodules, icon kissers. So you had smashers and kissers.
I guess I'd be more of a smasher.
Yes. You had one guy, John of Damascus. He was an advocate for icons, and this is what he said, quote, "To deny, as the iconoclast did, that any true icon could depict Christ was, in effect, to deny the possibility of the incarnation. Although it was wrong to worship an icon, the presence of an icon of Christ could instruct and assist the believer in the worship of the true Christ. Icons should be honored and venerated in much the same way as the Bible or the symbol of the cross," unquote. So he says, basically, icons, you can honor them, but you can't worship them. And they went into...
But that's always a very fine line, isn't it?
It's a fine line, man.
And people typically, even if the people who say that know where that line is, you give it a few generations and see if that line hasn't significantly blurred or moved.
And you look at some of these folks, they believe that you can pray through the icon. It's just a...
if you go to Russia today, go to a...
What was your experience? Did they have icons?
They do. And what they would do, they would come and...
Paul lived in Russia.
Yeah, I have for a couple different times. And, to me, the thing that sticks out in my mind, and when I went to an Orthodox church that was actively functioning as a church, honestly, the closest thing, the closest comparison I would draw would definitely not be to an American Protestant Christian church at all. It's much closer to what I saw when I went to Asia and went to a Buddhist monastery.
Really?
Yes, it's very much closer to a Buddhist monastery than it is. There's smoke,
idols.
there's incense, there's candles, there's not a place to sit. A lot of times, it's just you go in and stand in front of the icon, light a candle, kiss the icon, pray at the icon, and leave. That's about it. And sometimes a priest will come out and dangle the incense. What is it called? I forget the censer is the thing that holds the incense, and they dangle it, and they'll chant, and then they'll go away. But the concept of, I think now I didn't ever get a chance to go because I didn't speak Russian, But so I don't know. I guess they do have sermons or homilies, but I would imagine it's like the Catholic Church. Like they're much shorter,
right?
And it's certainly not a church with pews in it where everybody sits for an extended period and listens to the word being expounded. It's nothing like that.
Right.
It's very ceremonial.
Okay.
And so I can see how this is the human nature, the flesh. The tendency is, if you have these things in a supposed holy place, even if it starts out as, oh well, we're just using these to remind us, even if that's how it starts out, it's ultimately going to go right back to, Buddhist style, worshiping this thing.
It's interesting. The Eastern Church initially came out against icons.
Yes.
And they went back and forth for over 100 years until in 1843, Empress Theodora, she put it in the church calendar that, the worship of icons, we're going to do this, and it's not the worship, but the veneration of icons. It's in the church calendar to be celebrated annually in the East on Orthodox Sunday.
Yeah.
So you actually also had the Second Council of Nicaea, and they said at that council in 787 AD that Christians could revere icons but not worship them. The council condemned the iconoclastic movement and agreed with John of Damascus. So you had the church council come out and said, you can't worship them, but you can revere them. And then you had the Eastern Empire go back and forth. The Eastern Church went back and forth, iconoclastic, iconodules, kind of back and forth. And eventually Empress Theodora settled the issue, and this is what we're going to do with these icons, and they're going to be a part of who we are, and that and it continues to this day, as you just mentioned, with the Russian Orthodox Church.
It continues to this day for sure.
But I want to read just a little bit from. There's a website called Got Questions, and this is what they write. I just want to read a quick little article from Got Questions about icons. Here's what they say on Got Questions. Quote, broadly speaking, religious iconography is the artistic depiction of religious figures, often using symbolism. In Christianity, iconography features subjects such as Christ, Mary, or the saints. An icon is an image usually painted on wood that is to be venerated as a sacred object. Icons can also be engravings, mosaics, or embroideries. Although people who use icons in their worship would deny that they are practicing idolatry, it is difficult to see how venerating an object as sacred is different from idolatry. Also, Catholics venerate religious images. Iconography is often associated with, although Catholics also venerate religious images, iconography is most often associated with the Eastern or Orthodox Church, which teaches that the use of icons during prayer helps the worshiper know God, be united with the holy saints, and develop the fruit of the Spirit. When an Orthodox Christian enters his church, he lights a candle, makes the sign of the cross, and then kisses the icon of Christ and Mary and the saints. The church sanctuary will contain many other, quote, holy icons, as they're called. Orthodox Christians are to have icons at home, too, and the place where the icons are kept.
And in their car.
They have them in the car?
On the dashboard.
I did not know that. Well, they're to place the icons where family prayers are offered. Icons are seen as illustrations of the incarnation of Christ, who left his spiritual abode to dwell in a material world. The devout also believe that an icon is a window into heaven, and their veneration passes straight to heaven, where it is received by the person depicted in the icon. Some claim that icons have facilitated miracles. Unquote. That's from gotquestions.com.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
Paul,
no, they even drive around with them on their dashboard. Just like you've seen, you've probably seen Hispanic people driving around with Mary
right.
On their dashboard.
Right.
Russians drive around with icons on their dashboard.
Okay.
I mean, it's just, to me, it is idolatrous. But I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I'm sure a lot of people who listen to us probably did. And there's this one painting of Jesus I think everybody's seen. Baptist, looks like it was drawn in the 1950s or whatever, but it's usually like on the wall in the hallway where the Sunday school rooms are. If that rings a bell. Yeah. So that painting of Jesus that everybody's seen before, is that an icon, or why not? Because it hangs in the church. It depicts Jesus. Yeah. How is that an icon, or is it not an icon?
I don't think it's venerated. I just think it's just that's a picture of Jesus. Then you could say, okay, the series The Chosen, or Mel Gibson's movie The Christ.
Yeah.
Is that an icon?
Yeah, exactly. Is that an icon?
I don't think it is, because you're not venerating, you're not worshiping and praying to the movie or praying to that picture.
And was it John of Damascus you quoted who said, if you deny that an icon can depict Jesus, then you're denying the incarnation, right?
Yeah.
That's the argument. Well, if he really was incarnated, then you can draw what he looked like, right?
Yeah.
And that's true. Yeah. But is that all they're doing? Are they just drawing Jesus like we have a painting on the wall?
Yeah.
No, they're doing a lot more than that.
They're praying through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a big difference. You're right. You're exactly right. Well, that's one of the issues that created more and more tension between the West and the East branch of Christianity. Also, in 700 A.D., the Eastern Empire decided, you know what? Our official language, it's not going to be Latin. It's going to be Greek.
Yeah.
So now you have the Greek in the East.
So they're driving a wedge.
They're driving a wedge, and you have Latin in the West. And we're going to see that it's going to lead to what they call the Great Schism.
Yeah.
When there's going to be the official breaking of relationship between the Eastern Church and the Western Church.
It's kind of like how in the modern day, people try to drive a wedge by saying, well, we're not going to say A.D. anymore. We're talking about a year. We're going to say
Common Era.
C.E., Common Era. Yeah. We're not going to say A.D. It's not the year of the Lord.
Yeah.
So that's interesting how that stuff happens. But they're trying to drive a wedge.
Yeah.
They're trying to make a break.
Yeah.
Denounce the Christian origins.
Yeah. It's amazing. Well, that is the 7th and 8th century of church history. Paul, you got anything you want to close with?
No, I'm enjoying I'm mostly just sitting here learning from you, so I'm enjoying it.
Oh, goodness. We got to help you, Paul. We got to give you some better sources.
Yeah.
Okay, well, once again, thank you all for being with us on this episode of the Uncensored Pilgrims. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time when we'll deal with the 9th and 10th century of church history. And we need to let you know that the views that we express on this podcast belong to Marty McLain and Paul Price. They are our views. They do not reflect the views of anyone else. With that said, we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.